I live in Middle-earth. We did it. We moved here to Aotearoa, New Zealand, but it means that as a hobbyist, I am back to square one. All of my stupidly massive scenery collection isn't coming straight away, so I need some terrain to get Zorpazorp back on its feet. So today, I am going to show you the most important piece of scenery that you will ever need. But we're going to add a little Zorpazorp spin to it. A dash of the ridiculous, and a sprinkle of the stupidly massive.
Now, any scenery build requires materials, and while I posted over a few scenic supplies from Australia, there are a few things that are vital which just don't fit easily on the plane: timber and polystyrene foam. Now, unfortunately, the only little shack that we could afford to buy is nestled at the feet of the Misty Mountains in the South Island of New Zealand and hours away from the nearest big hardware store, so I jumped in the car and headed into town. For today's build, we'll need a bunch of pine of different lengths and some sheeting. I settled on composite hardboard or masonite because it's quite cheap for the strength, and then I hit the jackpot on foam, scoring a whole bunch of broken white polystyrene sheets for just $5. Now, this white foam is bubbly, expanded poly garbage, frankly, but it's light, cheap, and perfect for landforming that gets covered in scenics. But for high quality carving foam, we need a much better product, and I lucked out with a household insulation company willing to sell me single sheets, albeit pretty massive, so we've got some nice foam to get started. I even scored a box of really rare blue foam from one of my Patreons, Andy, so we are stocked up. Now, it's not just materials, I'm gonna have to rebuy all of my tools, and we don't have a heap of spare budget for that, so I'm having to buy really smart, just the essentials: a drill bits, screws, adhesives, and an axe, because trust me, in the Misty Mountains, that is essential. So what in Middle-earth are we making? Well, if you haven't figured that out, we are building a gaming board, but this ain't no ordinary gaming board. Today, I am building the most ultimate, versatile, modular, million landscapes in one gaming board that is going to be the centerpiece of a brand new wargaming studio. A studio for a very special purpose. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the Zorpazorp live streams are back. Here in the new house, I will soon have an entire room dedicated to the live streams, where we will relaunch our Battle Games in Middle-earth campaign, as well as a whole host of regular painting and gaming madness with everything from early edition Space Hulk campaigns, Middle-earth battle companies, narrative battles, and everything in between. I won't go full insane depth now, but it is going to be massive. So head on over to Zorpazorp Streams, our channel dedicated entirely to live streaming, and give it a subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the action as it all unfolds. There should be a little cue on the screen. Oh, and make sure that you subscribe to this channel here while you're at it.
Now, this may not look like much at the moment, but this is the beginnings of the most epic wargaming studio. And all of that begins with a truly epic wargaming board, which should drop in here behind me. So what do we need this board to do? Well, it needs to cover a whole lot of worlds. This needs to be the fantasy grassy landscapes of Middle-earth, the mines of Moria, all the woodlands that we know and love from Tolkien, but also the far distant future. Warhammer 40k, pieces of the Horus Heresy, anything that's grimdark and sci-fi and beyond. We might need some space to play board games like Space Hulk, some sort of versatile generic tabletop landscape. That is a lot of things for this board to be able to achieve, and it needs to be Zorpazorp quality. I'm not having the scenery on my live streams half-assed and rushed. This is going to be quite the build.
First of all, the board is definitely going to be a full 6x4, so it's time to knock up a nice simple timber frame, and here we come to our first moment of true genius. And it's not even mine, it's time to blatantly steal an idea from one of my best mates, Benji, from Benji's Hobbies. Now, Benny Boy recently smashed out a wicked build, a double-sided wargaming board with a timber frame on either side so that it could be flipped over with different gaming surfaces and then hung on the wall when not in use. Now, when when he sent me some snaps while he was working, my brain just exploded. This is exactly what I need for the upcoming studio board.
But then my brain did the usual Zorpazorp ADHD overdrive, and what started out as just stealing Benji's idea became so much more.
I've linked Benji's video up above, so definitely go and check that out, and let me know in the comments of my video or Benji's whose board you'd like to have in your house the most, and whoever loses the comment off will have to do something silly on the live stream during our official stream launch party on Zorpazorp streams. Now, I proceeded to follow Benji's video to start with, knocking up my timber frame around the panels, but sadly I had 3 small sheets rather than 1 nice long board, so I had to add some bracing on my first side. This whole build journey really struck home to me just how much I've left behind in Australia. I would never normally bother cutting anything like this with a handsaw, but my big boy drop saw is now on the other side of an ocean, and with no budget to get a new one, it's back to basics. I assembled the outer frame first and then screwed on the first panel, using it to make sure the outer frame was actually straight, and then attached my first support beam and worked across from there. You'll notice I've put the beams the flat side down to get me extra width to help catch the panels, but also to make sure they're lower than the outer rim, so hopefully we can hide them in just a moment. I then flipped it over, added another layer of bracing to give me a sweet wooden trim around my gaming area on both sides. Sadly, the price of timber here is really steep, so even though I wanted to use some stunning oak trim all around the edges, because the board is basically 2 boards in one, it just got so expensive, so we're left with our pine beams, but I gave them a little sand back just to try and make them a bit nicer.
So that is our frame complete, fully edged in timber and 2 different gaming sides, smooth on the underside, and then of course here we have our panel support beams. Now we need this one wargaming board to create infinite wargaming possibility, so we need some modular scenery. Now there were 2 main methods to create a modular wargaming landscape. You can have one big solid board that you then drop little scatter terrain pieces on and move those around to create variation in gameplay, or you can make modular boards where you've got squares or tessellatable tiles that you can move around to change the gaming landscape. And we are going to do both.
We're going to start with our support beam side, and our first step is to hide those beams to get one consistent landform, and for that, we are going to use those sheets of garbage white expanded polystyrene.
Don't forget this bad boy.
These were absolutely smashed up, so I grabbed sheets, cut them down to size, and glued them down onto the frame. Now, I should have used liquid nails or construction adhesive, but unfortunately I bought the red one, not the green one, which melts foam, and I really didn't want to drive all the way back to a hardware store and spend more money because the budget was already shot from the higher than expected timber costs, so I used my PVA glue. But please guys, don't use PVA. It's an amazing glue, but if you trap normal PVA between layers that are hidden from the air, you're looking at weeks before it's properly dried. To make matters worse, I realized about 2 days later that my Patreon Andy had also put in a tube of foam safe Sikabond in that care package he gave me, so I had the right stuff in my workshop all along. Anyway, moving right along. I built up the foam layers covering the wooden slats and then waited until the glue was gripping just enough that I could gently begin to carve back the surface. This gaming board needs to be relatively boring. It's essentially just a canvas for us to build on, but I then decided that I could give it some life without messing up the modularity too much. Most of the games that we'll play on this board will be 4x4, so by adding some features onto the sides of the board, I can simply shift where we are playing, and that way we can include or exclude them. So first I deliberately left one end of the board with one less sheet of foam so that I could carve a little sloped change in elevation, and then on the other side I just had to throw in a little river. This will be nice and small so it won't massively impact gameplay, but there are just so many scenarios in our Battle Games in Middle-earth livestream campaign that ask for a river, so I think it's worth it. I then grabbed a sanding block and smoothed out all of those features, and then used some multi-purpose filler and blended all of the transitions and gaps between our various layers, and there we have a solid, consistent gaming surface that we are ready to turn sexy with scenics. First, I grabbed some craft paints and mixed up a really mottled brown base tone to hide the bright white and give us an earthy foundation for our scenics, and then it is flocking time, baby, and we have got an absolute horde of foam flocks to use today. There is a huge selection of browns and greens and different blends, and importantly, a mix of grades. Some of the foam flocks are really fine, and some are more coarse and clumpy, and you'll see why that is amazing in just a moment. I set up a little flocking station to the side of the table, and then decided to have a play with just 1/3 of the board to see what I could come up with. But hobby challenges like realistic ground covering aren't the only thing on my radar at the moment. The big move to New Zealand has essentially functioned as a bit of a reset button for my work and family life and for my career here on Zorpazorp, and Skillshare is a fantastic way to gain greater control of your career and creative path. Now, you might know Skillshare for their courses in film and video editing, but they have hundreds of career-focused classes too. The new year is the perfect time to reinvent your goals and yourself. Zorpazorp was a huge career shift for me, and Skillshare gives me the power to keep reskilling as my industry and my needs change. With so much going on in life, time management and productivity has just been so key for me. So I've been checking out Ali Abdal's course, Productivity for Creators, and it's been so helpful. So jumpstart your 2023 goals now with this exclusive offer. Try Skillshare free for 7 days, and then get 20% off your first year. First, a big spritz of watered down PVA glue, and then I'm going to start with my Old Faithful, the fine green blend, and just give that a good sprinkling. Then I brought in some of the clump foam scatter, starting with the dark green and then the mid green. Applying these is a little bit of an art to control the amount of clumpiness, as you can sort of break it up to be relatively fine in your fingers as you apply it. I wasn't really keen on the dark green at all when I sort of first put it down. It's quite a cool toned green, but once you start accenting it with the warmer mid green, they actually look amazing together. Then I grabbed my second Old Faithful, my yellow, green, brown, fine blend. This is the perfect accent top coat to be the kind of brighter top leaves or foliage that's just starting to wilt a little amongst the greener landscape. For some little final accent experiments, I brought in some pure mid-green fine to kind of play with the idea of making little spots of different species of clover. I was pretty happy with how that was coming together. It's not perfect, but I'm liking the tones that we've got, so I spruced up the edges a little, and then I jumped out to the wider board to continue laying down and experimenting. This time lapse here really shows how the colors for this foundation layer kind of came together, and this is probably my favorite part in all of scenery making. I just love blending different materials on a board to try and simulate nature as best as possible. When I was happy with the main part of the board, I did a pass moving around the edges to make sure the flocks were consistent all the way up to our wooden borders. And then I made a mistake, guys. I got excited, very excited, and I hit the whole board in another soaking of watered down PVA. This was a bad move, folks, and you'll see why in just a sec. Oblivious to my huge stuff up, I moved onto the riverbank. Now, I'm running very light on base readies here in the new studio. We've only just arrived. Marky, who manages the Geek Gaming Australia and Zorpazorp warehouse back in Oz, has sent me over a care package, but it just hadn't arrived yet, so I decided to try the old-fashioned way and use some stones and gravel from my driveway to begin the riverbed, and it worked okay. I tried to get the smallest stuff I could, but the rock sizes are really just way too out of scale. I suddenly remember the entire reason we sell products for this stuff. But this will work okay as a foundation, and then I can fix it later and build it up with some arid earth or some scrublands when the package from zorpazorp.com arrives. So, the stuff up. The New Zealand autumn has truly hit, and it's pretty cold, and I'm used to building scenery on the Gold Coast of Australia, so my boards dry really fast. Here, they do not. This foundation layer of paint and PVA was so wet that the next layer of PVA actually washed back the brown paint to expose white polystyrene. If we jump back to the time lapse, we can actually see it happening in real time. Enhance. Enhance! Not good at all, folks. So, what are we gonna do? Well, we're just gonna pile on more flocks, of course. Flocks fix everything. To be honest, it's kind of not as scary as I first thought, because I need this board to be really strong and durable, so we basically want like a layer of solid flock anyway, so there shouldn't be any of that brown showing through. So I just piled on more and more flocks, trying to cover the white wherever I could, and it's looking much better, but it's not perfect yet. I waited overnight and then came back and did a little test, and the glue wasn't washing away paint anymore, so I could put down that that big layer of PVA, and now it is time to keep continuing with our next scenics layer. The foam flocks provide a nice base layer of grasses and shrubberies. I grabbed some pine forest base ready, which is a blend of stones, bark materials, twigs, and static grass fibers, which are meant to represent pine needles, and it's just the perfect addition to any green landscape. I gave it a generous sprinkling all over the place, kind of varying the amount to sort of build up different textures and add some nice color variation, and it was especially useful for hiding any of the remaining white foam parts that hadn't yet been covered. I then grabbed some green blend sawdust scatter and then started sprinkling it lightly around the place as a bit of an accent. This is the absolute way to get best looking terrain, folks. A huge variety in materials, just like we see in nature. The lighter color sawdust, which is naturally a more coarse texture, looks fantastic as a little foliage accent, and it kind of grows up above that foam flock layer. Now, if you think the board looks good now, just buckle up. We've done our foams, we've done our sawdusts, we've done our aggregates. Now it's time for the killer finale. You guessed it, the static grass. I grabbed every static grass fiber I had here in the workshop, and I got like a pinch of it and laid it out on the board so that we could see how the color blends meshed in with the landscape. And I picked two grasses to start with, the 4mm spring and the 4mm autumn blend from Geek Gaming. At first I was going to use the grass sort of quite sparsely as an accent just in certain areas, like working some spring green into the sloping hillside and other few kind of spots around the board. Then I grabbed my autumn and I started building up a few more accents, and then a few more, and then a few more, and oh my Iluvata, static grass just looks amazing and it's everywhere. To kind of get really good static grass, I applied it really unevenly. You want to vary the amount of grass and the color just to kind of make sure that it's not this big golf green. It's really broken up and different and visually interesting, and make sure you build it all the way up to the board edge. It's also really helpful for drawing the eye away from any obvious seam joins in the underneath foundation because it adds so much height variability to the board. While Lockie adds the sexy grass, I've got to shout out my Patreons and YouTube channel members, and we've had a bunch of new folks join the family after the Weta Workshop documentary that went out last week, so thank you so much for your support. I'm thrilled that you guys love that video, and I'm sure out of everyone, you guys are psyched to see this board because it is all about our Patreon livestream campaign. To see models named after you fighting over this very board, head on over to our Patreon, link down in the description, or simply click the join button down next to subscribe here on YouTube. I ended up being very happy with how these layers went down and gave it all a big soaking in watered down PVA glue and then left it for 2 whole days to get fully dry. The static grass is amazing for broad coverage, but we do need a little more spice, so it's time to add some grass tufts. I slapped down every tuft that I had and picked out a couple of colors, spring, autumn, and dead grass, and began to tear them up and apply them around the board. I decided to start out with our key land features. First up, our riverbank. I'm going to leave 3 gaps that I'll be building up with rocks when I finish off the riverbed with base ready and build into 3 fords, but in between those gaps, I'm going for a nice shrub-lined riverbank with heaps of tufts sporadically placed along the edge. Then to add to that effect, I grabbed some clump foliage and ripped it up into different pieces and placed them into some PVA glue. To blend those layers together, I sprinkled in some mid and dark green clump scatterflock and kept mixing all of these methods together until I was happy with the bank, then using some pine forest base ready and some fine flocks to help blend that riverbank foliage into the grassy plains. Happy with that look, I grabbed my tufts and placed a bunch around the rest of the board, building on areas of visual interest like our slopes and our little mounds, as well as using them to hide some paint marks on the wooden trim and hiding any polystyrene showing through. I'm really digging that, but I want to keep breaking up the flatness with more variation, so I brought back my clump foliage and my scatter clump flocks and built up some regions of denser flock. This was also useful for hiding paint stains and yet more exposed polystyrene. Man, that damn polystyrene. I just kept finding more and more of it showing through from the bottom, and I just had enough, so I grabbed my pine forest base ready and I combed over the whole board, and anytime I could see white foam showing through, I sprinkled it pretty heavily. The base ready is much denser than the foam layers so I could coax it down through the layers to hide the white foam nicely. I then blended that base ready back in with yet another pass of my various flocks and gave the whole board a huge soaking in isopropyl alcohol and Geek Gaming matte scenic sealant. And once that dried, we are done. And there we have the board itself, finally ready for some scatter terrain. I grabbed a few pieces of scatter that I'd posted over from Oz, just my Rohan kits and a few trees and hedges and walls, super generic fantasy wargaming stuff really, and threw it all down onto the board to give us an idea of how this bad boy is going to work on the live stream, and I think that that is a mega success. We still have a whole set of new scatter terrain to build using a system similar to the modular cliffs I built back last week, as well as some mental builds for the underside of this table, and they are like nothing that you will have ever seen on Zorpazorp, but all of that is going to have to wait until next time.